In this discussion, we will address the issue of reverse discrimination, sometimes referred to as affirmative action programs, looking not only at its moral status, but also its legal status, whether or not we think it's permissible or even obligatory to enact specific reverse discrimination programs. By way of background, there are, first of all, a few things that we need to address. Initially, what do we actually mean by discrimination? Discrimination is typically defined as treating another unfairly or unequally on the basis of irrelevant factors. The two most prominent irrelevant factors that are typically addressed in reverse discrimination programs would be irrelevant factors based on either sex or gender or race. And so it's possible to be involved in acts of either racism or sexism in terms of hiring practices. The evidence for both racism and sexism appears to be fairly prevalent, as well as obvious. It doesn't involve, in other words, specific detailed statistical analysis. It's merely something that most individuals would say obviously takes place. That individuals, for example, that are minorities are oftentimes discriminated against. This can be seen in factors like the fact that there are higher unemployment rates among minorities, as well as the fact that you find that they are oftentimes treated unequally based on equal educational levels. With respect to sexism, there again you'll be able to find that women typically make less than men, and that is usually referenced as something that's substantial as well as significant when addressed at from the reverse discrimination perspective. Why do people discriminate? In other words, why is it such a problem? It depends on who you ask. Many individuals will say that some of the racism and sexism is obviously merely blatantly based on differing attitudes, that certain individuals believe that individuals of minority races are incapable of doing the same sorts of things as those that are in the majority race, and by that we mean the whites or Caucasians. And other individuals will say that attitudes with respect to women haven't changed that much either, and that also results in things like sexism. So racism, sexism, what's the cause? Well, obviously attitudes on one level. One thing we do need to point out, however, is that a lot of individuals have pointed out that it's possible for someone to be inadvertently involved in an act of either sexism or racism. The fact that, for example, Caucasians have held places of power or have been in the position of hiring other individuals, just engaged in certain word-of-mouth recruiting practices results in something that may be not intentional, but result in something like either sexism or racism. The fact that you have specific tests, for example, that might be based on things that the majority race might be familiar with, and yet those that are of a minority background or race might not experience in their culture or among their ethnic group, would also result in some kind of unintentional type of racism taking place. Same thing with respect to sexism. Individuals have pointed to requirements involving either weight or height that are outdated or outmoded, resulting in acts of sexism when there's really no good reason to hold those in place. Again, it's not necessarily the case that individuals are in an intentional kind of way being involved in propagating either sexism or racism. Oftentimes, both practices of discrimination take place inadvertently or unintentionally. Well, why is it wrong? From an ethical or moral perspective, it doesn't matter whether you look at it from a consequential or a non-consequential perspective. Most individuals will say that either sexism or racism, because it's unfair, because it results in people suffering or being harmed, is immoral. The question, therefore, is not the question, is this permissible for us to engage in acts of either racism or sexism? The question before us today is to ask the question, is reverse discrimination the best way to resolve the problem? Is it the moral way to get rid of discrimination that has taken place in the past? Responses. From a legal perspective, in terms of what the government has done, obviously the government has passed several laws recently, and many laws throughout history dating all the way back to 1868, that have resulted in individuals of either a minority race or of the female gender presumably receiving some sort of preferential treatment. Actually, you can call this kind of preferential treatment a type of affirmative action program. So there has been obviously a response on behalf of the government. There are also have been responses on behalf of employers. Employers wishing to resolve the problem either because they're forced to from a legal perspective or because they want to do the just or the fair thing. Again, our purpose in today's lecture or discussion is to address whether or not affirmative action programs would be the best way to resolve these inadequacies, these unjust or unfair, unequal treatment of individuals in the past. Well, what do I mean by affirmative action program? Affirmative action programs are programs that are intended to correct the imbalances in employment that are due to discrimination on the basis of irrelevant factors. And so if we have sexual discrimination or discrimination on the basis of race, the affirmative action programs are those programs that are often mandated by the government as a means to correct the situation, correct the imbalance or the unequal treatment that's taken place in the past. The implementation of these affirmative action programs typically involves some sort of preferential treatment. And by preferential treatment, typically we mean reverse discrimination. And so if in the past blacks have been, for example, discriminated against, in the present the way that we will resolve that problem or address that issue, from the perspective of some anyway, is by enacting reverse discrimination, by discriminating in favor of the blacks today. Again, just as an example. Typically, reverse discrimination programs usually involve giving either preferential treatment among a pool of equally qualified applicants or giving preference to those who are less qualified among a qualified pool of applicants. You might also find something like setting of goals or actually attaining fixed numbers within specific employees' situations or within specific hiring situations. What we want to turn to now are the specific arguments either in favor of or in opposition to reverse discrimination, keeping in mind that reverse discrimination is also referred to as an affirmative action program or as a type of affirmative action program. What reasons might we have for thinking that reverse discrimination is the way to go? Well, from a consequential perspective, typically consequentialists or teleological theorists are going to emphasize good or better consequences from enacting reverse discrimination programs. What is central to these arguments, both for and against, and that you need to keep in mind as we look at and evaluate each of these arguments, is that typically they are based on statistical analysis and data. In other words, somebody might say that this will result in better consequences, higher pay, fewer people being unemployed, those sorts of things. And those sorts of things can be borne out in terms of statistics or in terms of scientific data. So arguments either for or against reverse discrimination are oftentimes based on empirical principles, things that can be established, confirmed, or repudiated by appealing to things like statistics. Well, what would a consequential consideration or an argument be in favor of reverse discrimination? The first thing that a consequentialist might point out is that discrimination puts minorities and women at a disadvantage. And reverse discrimination programs are the only means by which this can be rectified or solved. Additionally, discrimination, according to these consequentialists, might be pointed out to result in low family income, which ultimately ends up just continuing this cycle of poverty. Consequentialists might appeal to things like the example of specific individuals that we can look up to as being a good reason to enact reverse discrimination policy. For example, we need role models, someone like a Supreme Court Justice like a Sandra Day O'Connor, or someone like a military individual like a Colin Powell. These sorts of individuals can only be placed in the positions of power, of prestige, of the ability to make a difference if we have reverse discrimination programs in place. Colin Powell, for example, has stated on numerous occasions that he would not have made it as far as he had in life had it not been for affirmative action programs. What kinds of arguments might be given in favor of reverse discrimination from a non-consequential perspective? Obviously, a non-consequentialist won't be emphasizing something like benefits regarding pleasure or good or better consequences. A non-consequentialist is going to emphasize the issue of justice or fairness. Justice demands, according to the non-consequentialist, that compensation be given for the results of past discrimination. A non-consequentialist, therefore, is going to make the following argument or claim. Blacks and women, or Hispanics, Latino, it doesn't matter what minority that you look at, they've been discriminated in the past. And because of this, justice, fairness, the notion of equality or equal treatment requires, calls out for, demands for compensation. And the only way that we're going to be able to compensate these individuals is by enacting specific affirmative action programs in the present. Those are the arguments in favor of reverse discrimination. What about the arguments in opposition to reverse discrimination? Again, you can find consequentialists and non-consequentialists on either side of the issue. Those consequentialists who argue against reverse discrimination are going to emphasize, obviously, bad or worse consequences. They will make claims like reverse discrimination programs are expensive to implement, things that are expensive are relevant for an individual who's arguing from a consequential perspective, that it takes time, money, and effort to emphasize and to implement reverse discrimination programs. Furthermore, consequentialists are going to point out that reverse discrimination programs just simply don't work. Reverse discrimination oftentimes helps the middle-class minorities and not the lower-class minorities. It compensates those, in other words, who don't require compensation. If I am black and an affirmative action program is put in place to help those that are of a minority race or ethnicity, such as individuals who are African American, it's going to compensate me irrespective of whether or not I need help, irrespective of whether or not I need assistance. And furthermore, it doesn't compensate those that are really in need of compensation. You can think of, for example, someone who is born to a very poor family that grows up in poverty, but just so happens to be of the white race, happens to be Caucasian. This person who needs perhaps that hand up, that assistance from the government, is not going to receive it merely because of the color of their skin. Furthermore, another consequential consideration that's given on behalf of those who argue against reverse discrimination might be that it does more harm than good. It leads, first of all, to resentment, somebody might say. Instead of solving racial problems, it ends up increasing racial tension because someone from a majority race or ethnic background is going to look at someone from that minority background and say, the real reason why you have the job that you have, why you were picked over me, is merely because of the color of your skin. And so that might end up actually increasing racial tensions instead of solving them. In other words, it intensifies the problem. It doesn't solve it. It stigmatizes minorities and women. Those who receive aid are oftentimes viewed as, again, undeserving and unqualified. Furthermore, it makes those it is intended to help dependent upon such help. Individuals might not actually work toward getting a specific job or occupation because really all that they need is to have the right skin color or the right chromosome. That all that they really need to be able to receive some kind of job or an occupation or to be able to rise up through the corporate ladder is to just have the right skin color or to be a woman. And that's the kind of thing that, again, intensifies racial problems and problems among the sexes. It certainly doesn't solve it. It makes those, again, who it is intended to help dependent upon such programs, that they rely on affirmative action programs and that they don't attempt to better or help themselves through self-effort. They rely on the effort or the help of the government. Finally, another consequential consideration that's given in opposition to reverse discrimination is that it wastes the best resources. If I have a pool of qualified applicants and instead of choosing the one that's the most qualified, I choose one that's not quite as qualified, still qualified, but not the best, I'm really dumbing down my chances as an American of competing in the world market. And so a consequential consideration in opposition to reverse discrimination could be along the lines of any of these arguments. Again, it leads to resentment. It stigmatizes minority and women. It makes those it is intended to help really dependent upon such help or assistance. And finally, it wastes the best resources. What are some non-consequential considerations? Well, again, in the same way that a non-consequentialist would emphasize issues of justice in arguing for reverse discrimination, other non-consequentialists are going to emphasize instances of justice in arguing in opposition to reverse discrimination. The problem, as the non-consequentialist sees it, is that discrimination of any type is immoral. Discrimination on the basis of an irrelevant factor, whether it be in opposition to a minority or in opposition to a majority, is always going to be wrong, and therefore is always going to be immoral. If past preferential treatment, in other words, was wrong, then present preferential treatment is going to be equally wrong. What we're actually talking about, even in the word reverse discrimination, is discrimination. And discrimination on irrelevant factors, such as the pigment of one's skin, or whether or not one has two X chromosomes or an X and a Y, those are irrelevant. What we want to look at is whether or not a person is qualified. And if a person who is qualified is of the majority race or is male, then that's the person that ought to be hired. To do anything else is just unfair or is immoral. It rewards, or in other words, it punishes those who do not deserve reward and or punishment. It rewards the wrong group, those in the present. If individuals in the past have been discriminated against, then they are the individuals who need to be compensated, not individuals in the present. If those in the present who do not require compensation receive some kind of compensation, then again we have something that's unfair or unjust. It also punishes the wrong group. It punishes those in the present. If individuals in the past have discriminated, if, in other words, my ancestors have ended up discriminating against someone else in the past, then it's my ancestors who are in need of punishment, not me. Again, to base either punishment or reward on the basis of an irrelevant factor like skin pigment or sex, you're always going to be doing something that's immoral. So ultimately, what a non-consequentialist is going to say is that what you want to do is you want to make sure that the laws that have been passed to end the initial discrimination are enforced. In other words, people typically who argue in opposition of affirmative action programs would say that the reason why we continue to have the problem is not because we haven't instituted a reverse discrimination program. It's because we haven't enacted the laws that are currently on the books. Instances of discrimination are immoral. You're not supposed to discriminate on the basis of irrelevant factors like race or sex. And that's written on the books currently. So if the problem continues, if it hasn't been rectified or resolved, it's because we're not enacting those laws. All that we need to do is get tough with those laws according to those who argue against reverse discrimination. Where do you fit in terms of the topic or the issue? Do you believe that reverse discrimination is something that, although it's perhaps not the best alternative, or perhaps it's not the only way to solve the problem, is perhaps the only way in which the problems of discrimination are going to be met, that they're going to be resolved? Or do you believe that reverse discrimination as a type of discrimination is itself an immoral thing? Take a look at the arguments and ask yourself, do you believe that affirmative action programs or reverse discrimination programs are moral or are permissible?